Hi, boys and girls. Here's chapters 10 and 11 of The Great Molasses Flood. Chapter 10. Was this how Papa felt when the tidal wave swept up over their village? When the churning water grabbed him and Carmen and pulled them out to sea? No, Carmen thought, because this wave was nothing like water. It was thick and gooey. It felt alive as it rose up around her legs. Carmen had read about a kind of snake that wrapped itself around its prey, choking it to death. Now Carmen felt like 1,000 snakes were wrapping themselves around her, trying to pull her down. She and Tony locked eyes. What should they do? What could they do? It became impossible to run. Each step was a battle through the thick slime, and with every blink the molasses was rising higher. To their waists, to their chests. Carmen's clothes were soaked. The goo coated her skin. It was already hardening around her, trapping her inside a shell. The molasses was up to her chin now. Globs splashed into her mouth, sticky, sweet, sharp, and bitter. It made her think of rot, of old garbage left out in the sun, buzzing with flies, crawling with rats. Her stomach twisted. She was afraid she would be sick. She and Tony looked desperately around, but everyone near them was struggling too. There was nobody here to help them. Carmen thought of Papa again, how he'd found that old shutter to float on. That's what they needed, a piece of wreckage to keep them from sinking. And just then, Carmen saw it. Something big, made of wood. It was part of a horse wagon. "Tony, grab that!" she screamed. There was not a second to waste. It took all of Carmen's strength to propel herself forward through the muck. She pulled herself up on the wagon, so half of her body was out of the molasses. Tony grabbed hold of the side, but before he could pull himself up, he lost his grip on the slime-covered wood. Carmen clung to the wagon with one hand, and she reached down with the other. She managed to grab Tony's arm, and with every last bit of strength she had, she yanked him up hard. He threw his arms over a wagon wheel, locking them together. The wagon bobbed and wove in the churning molasses. Terrible sounds rose up around them, cries of fear and moans of pain, the screeching of metal. Molasses coated Carmen's face, an itching, burning, dripping mask. She and Tony huddled together, too terrified to talk. All they could do was look around in horror. Now Carmen knew how Dorothy felt when she fell out of that tornado and landed in the strange land of Oz. Except that Oz was a magical land filled with bright colors and jeweled cities. This strange place was a nightmare, a wasteland of rubble covered with brown slime. The destruction reminded Carmen of the pictures she'd seen in the newspapers of the battlefields of the Great War. The cities and forests of France and Belgium turned to charred ruins. Wagons, motor cars, and parts of buildings swirled around them, and people. A man, his shoulder badly bloodied, clung to a barrel. Another man was thrashing wildly, trying to keep his head above the surface. A woman was face down, not moving at all. How many people were trapped in this flood? Dozens? Hundreds? Was Tony's family safe? What about Mr. Lawrence and the kids at school? And what about Rosie? Carmen leaned harder against Tony, and that's when he screamed, "Watch out!" From nowhere, a giant piece of the tank smacked into the wagon, nearly flipping it over. Tony managed to keep his grip, but Carmen slipped off. "Carmen!" Tony's voice was the last thing she heard as the molasses swallowed her up. Chapter 11. Carmen desperately kicked her legs and spun her arms. She stretched out her neck to try to get her head back above the goo, but the molasses was like quicksand. The more she flailed, the deeper she sank. Beneath the surface, claws of metal raked into her leg, splitting open her flesh. She felt her blood spill out, gushing into the swirling river that was carrying her away. It was no use struggling, she realized. The molasses was too strong, too powerful. How did she think she could fight back? The force of the flood pushed her forward. She somersaulted in the muck. She gagged and coughed, struggling to breathe through her molasses-clogged nose and mouth. No, she couldn't fight this. It was impossible. Soon there was only darkness and pain. And then a voice in her mind, just a whisper at first. "Hold on." It got louder. "Hold on." Papa? Was he here with her? No. It was just his voice calling to her. He was telling her what she needed to do, but this time Carmen was all alone in the raging flood. It would be up to her to keep herself afloat, and she would not give up, not without a fight. She somehow managed to straighten her body. She let herself sink down until her feet touched the solid ground. Then she pushed off, propelling herself up through the goo. Her head broke through the surface. She managed to take a breath before she sank down again. Hold on! Down and up she went, over and over again. The fourth time she came up, she managed to open her burning eyes for just a few seconds, long enough to see an empty wooden crate floating by her, long enough to reach out for it, to get her arms around it. She held on, like she had before, like Papa had taught her. Blood spilled from her leg. Her heart slowed. The world became blurred. Sounds faded. But she didn't let go. Not until the men found her washed up next to a smashed house and pried her arms away. They wiped the molasses from her nose and lifted her up. Sirens wailed. Voices called to her. But Carmen felt very far away from the north end. In Carmen's mind, she was with Papa, and she didn't want to leave him. Wow. Great 2 chapters. We'll see what happens tomorrow.